Welcome to the Reconnaissance Energy Africa, or Recon Africa conference call to update operational activities in the Kavango Basin in Namibia and Botswana. All lines are currently on mute to prevent any background noise. This call is scheduled for 60 minutes. I would like to remind you that this conference call is being recorded. Any questions relating to the call can be directed to the company at investors@reconafrica.com. This call contains forward-looking statements which reflect the current expectations or beliefs of the company based on information currently available. Forward-looking statements are subject to a number of risks and uncertainties that may cause the actual results of the company to differ materially from those discussed in the forward-looking statements. Factors that could cause actual results or events to differ materially from current expectations are disclosed under the heading Risk Factors and elsewhere in the company's annual information form dated April 30th, 2021. Any forward-looking statement speaks only as of the date on which it is made, and the company disclaims any intent or obligation to update any forward-looking statement. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Grayson Anderson, Head of Capital Markets of Recon Africa.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's conference call to review Recon Africa's operations in the Kavango Basin in Namibia and Botswana. I'm joined today by Scott Evans, our Chief Executive Officer, and Dr. James Granith, our Chief Geoscientist. A few weeks ago, we provided an update by press release on the drilling of the Makandina Eta-2 well, the third well in our multi-year drilling program. And I want to stress the overall exploration program because everything we have been planning in 2022 and into 2023 is based on drilling multigraphic test exploration wells after acquiring over 1,200 kilometers of 2D seismic in 2021 and so far in 2022. Although we did not find a commercial accumulation of oil and gas in the Makandina Eta-2 well, it was the third consecutive well that we have drilled which confirms a working petroleum system throughout the Kavango Basin. Not a four-way closure is a risk that we faced when drilling the first well in the Karoo Graben off a single line of 2D seismic. But we had confidence in the well because of the strong results we had from the Kawe 6-2 well, which was just over 6 kilometers away from the 8-2. Importantly, the Makandina Eta-2 well shows the prognose thickening of the Karoo Rift section and continues to highlight the migration of hydrocarbons throughout the Kavango sedimentary basin. The well was drilled on time and safely and provided important subsurface data, including hydrocarbon gas liquids and gas samples, reservoir quality rock samples, and importantly, we encountered all the expected zones and horizons at the intervals predicted. Scott and Jim will add more technical details in a moment. I'd like to take some time now to put the progress of the exploration in the Kavango Basin into focus. Since 2019, we acquired the Jarvie-1 rig, refurbished it, and transported it over to Namibia, a strategic and valuable asset, which has provided us significant flexibility over the past 2 years. Interestingly, the last time our share price was at current levels was when we were moving the rig over ahead of drilling the 6-2 well. If everyone remembers, we were planning to drill at least 3 test wells in 2021, but success from the first 2 wells required the company fast-track moving into the acquisition of seismic data to build our understanding of the subsurface geology. The first phase of seismic, with over 450 kilometers, led to a third-party resource report from Netherlands Sewell & Associates, 35 potential locations, 25 targeting oil prospects, and 10 targeting gas prospects. It also identified a potentially new hydrocarbon play, the Damara Full Belt. We will be using the data we acquire each year to update the prospective resource report, with the next version expected in the second quarter of 2020. Our second phase of seismic, with over 761 kilometers, has provided a significant inventory of additional opportunities and provided validation of the Damara Fold Belt and its extent. It's also providing additional data to de-risk some of the locations from the resource report, including the Wisdom 5-1 well, which has one line of seismic from Phase 1 and 2 lines of seismic from Phase 2. I would also like to remind listeners that the 5-1 lead has over 766 million barrels of original oil in place, with over 153 million barrels of oil recoverable on an unrisked basis based on the Netherlands Sewell report released in April. It had a higher recovery factor and a higher chance of success than the Macandina Eta-2, even based on the first phase of 2D seismic. We have just started the acquisition of up to a further 1,500 kilometers of 2D seismic as part of phase 2, which will further increase our understanding of the basin and continue to generate prospects. And we have some good maps we'll present later, which shows how much our coverage has increased. We have already demonstrated from our wells that we have both structural and stratigraphic traps, multiple play types, and opportunities at multiple intervals throughout our acreage. We've got enough cash to keep our exploration activities going into the third quarter of 2023, with a lot of material catalysts to be delivered between now and then. You've got to remember, we control the rights to the entire sedimentary basin, the Kavango Basin, 8.5 million acres, and the government has given us another year in our first phase of exploration, which means we can keep the land consolidated until January the 29th, 2024, and continue to explore the Kavango Basin under our exploration agreement as far out as 2029 under the terms of the petroleum license. The government is very supportive, given that we're well ahead of our work commitments, and we are employing a lot of people locally, in addition to the benefits received from all the ESG projects that we continue to execute. All the factors are important as we aggressively start the joint venture process, which is underway and includes all the seismic data that we've acquired and processed to date, the data from the 3 wells we have drilled, and that we will continue to populate the data room with additional information as more data is acquired. Interest in the JV process has been positive so far, with a number of companies participating, ranging from small companies to IOCs and state and national oil and gas companies. We have enough cash to fund our exploration into the third quarter of 2023 as we target to execute a JV process, which is expected to bring in additional cash and work commitments to further our exploration programs out into 2024 and beyond. I will now turn the floor to Scott, who will go through our updated understanding of the basin and some more detail on the Macandina Eta-2 well before Jim goes into some detail on the upcoming Wisdom Farm 501 well.
Thank you, Grayson, and hello, everyone. It is remarkable that each of the 3 wells drilled to date in this new basin have encountered a working petroleum system. Light oil in the first well, light oil and relatively dry gas in the second well, and in the third well, the Macandina well, gas with hydrocarbon gas liquids, HGLs. This means that although the gas is collected in isotubes at the surface, it is possible that some of these gases were liquids at pressure in the subsurface. Now, you can see from our updated play map that the recent round of 2D seismic and stratigraphic wells is enabling us to continuously de-risk and update our existing prospects and add new ones. This process is ongoing today as we integrate the final processing from the current phase 2 data and a new vertical seismic profile from the most recent well. The map shows the extent of the initial exploration concept, the Karoo Rift. That's in green. And this was the concept that we came to the basin with as the first idea. It's the green slash going across the map. Now, the Damara Fold Belt, shown in purple, extends over the southwestern quarter of our acreage. Now, the seismic, which will be shown later, includes some really impressive structures. They all have a consistent northwest orientation. And if you look on the map, these are these light blue lines with arrowheads, each of which is an anticline. The new seismic is also identifying a number of new leads and prospects that are fairly typical of the Rift Basins, the original play. The fact we've encountered slightly different hydrocarbons in each well shows that there's likely more than one source rock system at play. We've proven that we have all the elements in a hydrocarbon play: source, trap, seal, reservoir, and charge. And we feel that they will align in the same place to enable a commercial discovery. So, as a review, we have these 3 major play types throughout the Kavango Basin. The first is the one we've been expecting from day one, the Karoo Rift fill, which is drilled as expected with the Macandina A2 well encountering a good thick reservoir interval. The second are fault blocks, we call them infra-rift, which we first encountered in the 6-2 Callaway well. These are fault blocks within the Rift Basin. Additionally, the third play, the Damara Fold Belt, the extent of which we can now see from the initial interpretation of the phase 2 seismic data. The carbonate reservoirs with matrix porosity up to 17% and core calibrated water saturation as published from the results of the 6-2 are the target reservoirs for this play. The presence of pre-Karoo reservoir and source rocks was always expected as a secondary objective in the basin, but the scale, coherence, and extent of these structures in the Dahmer Fold Belt is much larger than we expected. Very positive endeavor. Okay, now this seismic schematic shown as the next slide shows the exploration concepts with the Dahmer Fold structures on the left, and then the rift cutting down like a valley into the older rocks and being filled with Karoo sediments as you move to the right. The addition of the Dahmer play and the details we are seeing in the rift play are driving us to acquire additional seismic data and other geophysical tools. In addition to the aforementioned new 1,500 kilometers of 2D seismic data that we've permitted and just begun acquiring, we are planning a full tensor gravity program that is expected to get us better 3D subsurface imaging and will help us understand hydrocarbon migration patterns and the best places for accumulations. When this full tensor gravity is calibrated with 2D seismic, it'll be a big help in targeting the best areas to be considered for future wells. So the Dahmer Fold Belt sits in pre-Karoo age rocks within the Kavango Basin, and it's structurally similar in nature to something like the Alberta Fold Belt in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin as you ended into the Rocky Mountains. One of the distinguishing features of fold belts is their ability to create large linear four-way traps and closures, which are essential for commercial reservoirs. We expect the Dahmer to be more gas and condensate prone than oil prone given its depth and age. Now, the Karoo Rift trend and inter-rift fault blocks formed in the early Permian on top of these pre-Karoo Dahmer Fold Belt rocks from a time perspective. And as Jim will point out later, based on some of the seismic lines provided, there's a significant number of rift basin traps that are identified from the new 2D we've acquired, whereas in the pre-Karoo, the number of traps is fewer, but the size of the structures are quite large. So, if we talk about the Macadamia 8-2 well, what did we learn? So first, in the Karoo section, we saw thickening of this section as predicted from the seismic, and in particular, the lower, older section. Reservoirs, seal, and potentially source rocks. We ran a vertical seismic profile to characterize this Karoo interval so we can tie it to the seismic data, and it's by far the thickest Karoo we've seen to date, and we're going to use this to calibrate future interpretation. Now, this is the first well drilled within the Karoo Rift Basin, and we are encouraged that all the target intervals came up at depths predicted, which makes, of course, for safer drilling, but also, most importantly, gives us comfort in the quality of the 2D data and our ability to calibrate it for future prospects. We encountered new rocks in this well, specifically Karoo age rocks that were at deeper depths than the 6-1 and 6-2 wells, and also showed good reservoir qualities with some rocks with potential over 20% porosity being the storage capacity of the rock. Another sign of encouragement for future wells. We acquired sidewall cores in both the Karoo and the pre-Karoo. Now, this complete core analysis will not be done until Christmas with core labs in Houston. So we are seeing new reservoir source and seal rocks in each new well, but this core data is the ground truth that we use to calibrate the wireline logs. In the Macadamia well, we also encountered several gas-rich intervals with methane and hydrocarbon gas liquids ranging from ethane, which is C2, up to pentane, which is C5. These samples were captured at the surface from mud flow line in pressurized canisters. They're called isotubes. Isotubes were sent to Houston for gas analysis, showing the methane and the heavier hydrocarbons. The analysis also proved that these are thermogenic hydrocarbons, i.e. they were created from organic matter that was converted to hydrocarbons over temperature and pressure through time. But this is similar to what was noted in the analysis of the gas seeps in our basin. So this is requisite to having commercial accumulations of oil and gas, because the other way of forming hydrocarbons in the earth is biogenic, so from biologic, shallow degrading material. And this does not usually accumulate in traps that are big enough to be anywhere near commercial. So the fact that it's thermogenic is a big de-risking factor. So while noting hydrocarbons mentioned above, we did not encounter commercial volumes of the hydrocarbons in the well, most likely due to a lack of trap. But the well has validated several key concepts in our exploration program, and we have extracted significant positive technical information from this well, the first in the rift, which will be used as we progress our exploration program within the basin. So now I would like to introduce the next planned location. It's called the Wisdom Farm 5-1. This well location has the potential to test several planes at several levels in the sequence around the area, and based on the seismic, is in a different and deeper area of the Karoo Rift Basin. And I'll turn the call over to Dr. James Grenath, our chief geoscientist, who will bring together the integrated subsurface picture for the Wisdom Farm area and the exciting new Domrel play. Jim?
Thank you, Scott, and good day to everyone. As Grayson noted, exploration in a frontier basin is a process involving the systematic collection of subsurface information and progressively organizing it into a coherent, but I have to emphasize, an evolving plan to locate commercial hydrocarbons. The Wisdom 5-1 well is the next step in that process, and it's a bit of a step out from our core area, the first three wells. It's a substantial step forward in exploring the Rift play in that the Netherlands Sewell and Associates rated the prospect to target over a potential 766 million barrels of oil in place. Right now, the prospect has 3 lines of 2D seismic constraining it. At a location on the rift floor, where a step fault affords a large cluster of potential traps than we have had before. The 3 lines do not mean we have a perfect imaging of the prospect, but rather that we have a better control on Wisdom than we did on the previous 3 wells. You'll remember the very first one was a blind stratigraphic test, and that Macandina was the first drilled on a real prospective structure. This prospect takes a step forward toward the deeper and wider part of the basin. This is one of the reasons we decided to change our next location to 5-1 from our previous plans. We've got additional pre-Karoo section at this location. I'll come back to that in a minute. But most importantly, we have a little different stratigraphy within the rift. Based on our interpretation of Phase 1 and Phase 2 seismic data across the whole of the rift basin. This is important because rift basins are notorious for rapidly changing stratigraphy from location to location. Of the 3 seismic lines that control the structure, 2 cross at about 3 kilometers apart at about the same elevation, which suggests continuity over at least that distance and probably considerably more. We're looking at 2 intersects on what we're presuming is a coherent structure. It also has several different possible trapping positions within the structure. What I mean by that, when we look at the 5-1 well in cross-section. An important aspect of this is that we'll be able to test different kinds of potential traps at different elevations. So the previous 3 wells were defined in a relatively small area of the rift and thus saw more or less the same stratigraphy. This new prospect will be able to test several levels in this new stratigraphy. You can see from our schematic diagram here that several zones of interest can be reached in the main wellbore. They're shown in yellow, and additional ones can be accessed with a sidetrack from the main Wisdom Farm 5-1 well. You can see the fault system under the prospect sets up sort of a step in the floor of the rift. Off to the right, you can see the edge of the rift at the right side of the diagram. And off to the left, you can see the deeper part of the rift. The fault system under the prospect is actually a single fault that connects together. All of these separate different fault strands connect together, gather into one system. In addition to the Karoo, more than likely there will be a different section below the Karoo, and what we are calling the pre-Karoo. I'll have more to say about this in a moment, but recall that hydrocarbons were found in previous wells below the rift basin, which was unanticipated at the outset of the exploration program. Getting back to the prospect, let's look at some of the details. This is one of the 3 lines controlling the structure. The other 2 are a line about 3 kilometers to the west and a tie line between the 2. We're basically looking at 2 transects on what we're presuming is a coherent structure. In this line, The Karun starts at the top of the section at the yellow, right below the first red. The red is the basalt at the top of the section. The well then goes down all the way to the Dwika, which is at the bottom of the Karoo, at the pea green color horizon sitting at the bottom of the rift. Sitting on the base of the rift section is the unconformity at the second red horizon. Horizon is a term that's used in the industry to indicate these surfaces that separate the stratigraphy into its formal structure, which has source rocks in it at other locations in Namibia, quite important and quite rich source rocks. Looking down the wellbore, we get traps at different levels. For example, we have a nice closure at the dark blue level, which is basically the shallowest closure that we will test. It's about 3 kilometers wide. There's another at the green level, right adjacent to the fault, which is the top of the Eka formation. The Eka is basically the boundary in the middle of the Karoo in the previous slide. Within the Eka, you'll see 3 horizons, all of which define a collection of smaller closures. These have more complicated relationships to each other, which give us several stratigraphic trap possibilities in addition to the structural closures. Specifically, there are some fan deposits along the steppe in the basin floor, as well as mounding on the basin floor, particularly in the yellow section. And then below this is the Dwika, again with some fan thickening. You can see how it thickens up against the fault surfaces. The main wellbore will be drilling the high side of one of these faults internal to the rift, but not as high as the 6-2 well did. All of these trap possibilities reduce the risk for wisdom in that they lend multiplicity to the trap play factor. Remember, a common way to systematize the risk on prospects is to break the geology into play factors, generally 4. The source rocks for hydrocarbons, a reservoir rock to host the hydrocarbons in a recognizable trap, and a seal over the trap to keep the hydrocarbons in. Timing factors, as in maturation and migration, are also important in the sense that the hydrocarbons have to be generated at an opportune time to migrate toward and to be captured by the trap. All of it starts with the trap, however, and in most cases, the more the better. The other wells have taught us that there are source rocks because of the occurrence of hydrocarbons in all 3 wells, which is rather remarkable. At Wisdom, we will get a look at a different section, which will afford us a chance to actually recover and tie the hydrocarbon samples we have to their source rock. Reservoir quality rocks have been found in the other wells, so we know they exist in the basin. At this point, we just have to presume we will encounter them again. Seal on the trap is one of the most difficult things to pin down when you're doing any kind of exploration, and particularly at this early stage in the program in a new basin with complicated stratigraphy. At any one particular location, the seal physics is not as simple as just having a shale, but we have had seals in the other wells, so again, we can anticipate them being here as well. Finally, in this rendition of the seismic data, you can see that there are folds below the red unconformity at the base of the Karoo. The 6-2 well tested rocks below the wavy blue horizon. Wisdom will test younger rocks above the wavy blue horizon, potentially in a more familiar fold-style closure. We'll get back to this when we talk a little bit more about the Damara play that we've started to flesh out. So let's step back and look at the bigger picture of the Phase 2 seismic data. In addition to adding to the inventory of new opportunities and fleshing in the 5-1 area, the more uniform net of data has given us a clearer picture of the Kavango Rift and allowed us to map 10 units around in detail. We've hung real rocks on this network in only one area. The 5-1 will add another area to the data set. But as Scott mentioned, one really big step forward is the confirmation of the viability of a new play. We saw folds below the unconformity in several of the Phase 1 lines and in the previous line we looked at. But phase 2 clarified these and allowed us to project some of them over rather large distances, using help from the surface geology to the southwest of PEL 73. The play map at the beginning of this slide deck showed our mapping of the trend of these structures in the southwestern part of the block. These structures are the frontal fold belt of the Damara orogen that crosses Namibia and continues into Botswana and all the way across to eastern Africa. It is covered by the Kalahari just south of the block. We expected this belt, but not the obvious targets that we have now, structures of several hundreds of kilometers in area with four-way closure typical of many fold belts. These are direct analogs to giant Zagros fields in Iran and Iraq. I worked both of these for Conoco and more recently in northern Iraq for several operators. Or, as mentioned earlier, another analog is the Alberta Rockies on the west side of the Canadian Sedimentary Basin. So let's look at the typical rift data that we have now added to the data set, which is a sample phase 2 line. It is a good one to show some of the variety that we're now able to compare and contrast across the main rift. And it starts to show the beginning of some parallel satellite rifts, which may open up entirely new opportunities. The one on the right here on the seismic line is a pretty good example. It shows a little bit different stratigraphic architecture in it than the main rift. It may open to the southeast and actually be another play in and of itself. As is typical of all hydrocarbon-bearing rifts, such as the East African rifts or the North Sea or the rift basins in Indonesia, the structure is a network of faults with a variety of types of connections between them. These fault systems separate individual depicenters that lie above the blocks between the faults. If you think of the faults as cracks, they connect to each other in many different ways, leaving these kinds of small fault blocks, as you see, say, in the middle of the seismic line here. They separate out subsidiary grabens. The faults have relays between themselves. If you look in the central part of this particular seismic line, just to the left of the blue fault, all of those faults are basically the same fault system. The systems join and diverge along their length where they essentially leave what's called a relay ring. That's where the Uganda discoveries were initially made on these ramps. Now look at some of the horizons. Notice there are differences between these three depicenters on the line. There's one on the far left, there's one in the center, and the one I previously mentioned on the right. Notice that there are different stacking of different horizons with it. Different combinations of layers set up different stratigraphic environments to set up different source rocks and different reservoir rocks. This is an illustration of what I was trying to say earlier, that rifts change their character along length and they afford different opportunities, unlike many marine situations. So with the addition of the phase 2 data, we've been fleshing out a really good picture of the anatomy of the rift, and we've got a framework for the stratigraphy to embellish as we go into the third phase. In the end, we'll have a really good extensive picture of the anatomy of the rift. So let's talk about the picture we are developing of the new play. In the next slide, you can see a sample of the play that we didn't anticipate from the outset of the exploration program. This is part of a long line from a new data that shows a train of simple anticlinal folds. This is a line that we can see the Karoo section equivalent to, but thinner than in the rift, up here between the two red horizons. The top red horizon is the basalt we talked about before. The second red horizon is the unconformity bracketing the Karoo. We still have a lot to learn about the stratigraphy below this unconformity, but based on published literature, we will see much of both the Molden and the Otavi groups in places where they're in sequence. We've seen them dismembered by the thrust faults in the previous wells. I've highlighted three new horizons in this particular line. The green one is a pick about midway in what we expect to be the Molden group. The blue one is near what we expect to be the Otavi carbonates, and the yellow one is in the middle of the Otavi section. These are taken from locations farther to the west where they've been tagged with other seismic data and wells. The 3 wells we've drilled so far have come down through the Karoo, and they've only tagged a few hundred meters into the pre-Karoo below the red unconformity. They've done it off to the west of this line, outside the area of these simple structures. The 3 wells have probably penetrated the Otavi part of the section, down here below, between the blue and the yellow, where that part of the section is brought up to shallower levels close to the unconformity on thrusts in the fold belt. So except for some of the rocks in the previous wells, this upper section of Molden above the blue horizon will be an entirely new section to test. And it's presumed elsewhere in Namibia to be the host of several source rocks. In this play, the wells will have to be deeper to test the Molden and the Otavi, all the way down to about 1,800 mils, which you can see on this seismic line, which is probably on the order of 9,000 or 10,000 feet. The best thing about the Otavi, about the Damara fold belt, is that the structures are remarkably simple and clear. Fold belts typically have great four-way closure, much more so than rift basins, and the structures can be very large, as I mentioned, multiple tens of kilometers in length and several kilometers in width. We know this to be the case here from 100 kilometers to the southwest, where these folds are exposed in the surface in Namibia. Finally, I'd like to highlight to everyone listening how our recently started 2D seismic program will acquire up to 1,500 kilometers of additional seismic data. That would be on top of the 1,200 or so acquired in 2021 and so far in 2022. This is a map of the Phase 1 data. I think you can appreciate how superficial this data set would be in understanding the architecture of the rift. Adding in the Phase 2 data, as in the next slide, improves the picture considerably. But notice that the rift, which trends northwest to southeast, is not really covered very well in the southeastern part of the block, toward the Khoudoum National Park. Both of these 2 data sets have been processed and interpreted. The 2 lines I showed you are samples of the results of that. Through both iterations, our data quality has been improving, and we are able to acquire data much more efficiently than when we started. Now, in this new data set, on the next slide, with the yellow lines added, I think it's easy to see how we will not only have a good coverage of the rift, but also the Damara play, while still sticking to the roadways and fire breaks. We're doing this all in an environmentally sustainable way, using wireless nodes and accelerated weight drop systems for Polaris. There's virtually no footprint left behind in this seismic program. I'll turn the presentation back to Grayson, who will provide some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jim. We hope that this presentation has provided everyone with more insight into our exploration program to date and some of the exciting things we are working on. For many of our investors and listeners to this call, the presentation might seem a bit too technical or too detailed, but what we're doing is acquiring as much data as we can to de-risk our future exploration program, with the goal of delivering a drilling program that will result in commercial accumulations of hydrocarbons in the Kavango Basin for the benefit of the people in Namibia, the people of Botswana, and our shareholders. We have enough cash and capital to execute that program into the third quarter of 2023, and are going through a venture process that is expected to fund operations throughout 2023 and into 2024 and beyond. It can't be stressed enough that we own 8.5 million acres, the entirety of the Kavango Basin, what we believe is the largest undiscovered onshore hydrocarbon basin in the world, and highest impact onshore oil and gas exploration in the world. We have the support and a cooperative and respectful relationship with local and national government, as demonstrated by our recent extension to our first renewal period out to 2024. We have multiple play types with a proven rift basin and significant upside potential from the Damara Fold Belt, which will be targeted this time with the Wisdom 5-1 well. And our knowledge and understanding of our key plays is growing every day as more and more data becomes available from the wells that we have drilled, the existing and new seismic being acquired, and all the additional activity that's taken for the remainder of this year and into 2023. All of that data is now in the data room, which we'll be using to attract high-quality partners so that we can accelerate the exploration and ultimately the development of the Kavango Basin. Thank you, everyone, for attending our call today. I'll now turn it back to the operator.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's call. Just a reminder that should you have any further questions, please email investors@reconafrica.com. This concludes the call. Thank you all for participating.